Welcome to the Open Forum conversation discussing why a country as rich as the UK is facing food poverty. I'm Lizzie Cho. I'm the CEO of a social change charity based in North Kensington. And at our charity, we work with around 2,000 people each year, 80% of whom earn under £20,000 a year, their annual household income, and 60% of the children are recipients of free school meals. So I'm really interested to have this conversation with Professor Gwyddion Prince, Tristram Stewart, and Baroness Verma, all of whom you'll hear a bit more about later. Each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes to speak, and then I'll ask a question to all of the panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Our first person to speak is Gwyddion Prince, who is a leading expert in military strategy and over 20 years as Director of Studies in History at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, is currently Emeritus Research Professor at the LSE. And he is going to speak first. So I'm going to pass straight over to Professor Prince.
Thank you, Lizzie, and good morning, everybody, and good morning, everybody who's watching this podcast. It is not an extraordinary question that we should be discussing this in the country which is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, and which in terms of its soft power is generally ranked in geopolitical studies as being the 2nd most influential country in the world after the United States. But we find ourselves in a situation where you had that poor lady who was describing hunter mode as she went through the supermarkets. So to start off, let me give you 3 things which I think do not explain the situation that we're in. And then I'll mention 6 or 7 which I think are worth exploring in detail. The first thing that this is not about is the effect of leaving the European Union. That's absolutely clear now, which may surprise many people listening because particularly just recently, organs like the Office of Budget Responsibility have been pushing all sorts of predictive models which suggest that somehow the British economy has been impacted negatively since 2016. Well, as it happens, conveniently for this podcast, a major review of government figures was published just last week by a couple of leading economists and show that there's no hard evidence that leaving the EU has had really any major impact on the UK economy. We're comfortably mid-range in terms of our growth, and the famous figure that we're going to face some sort of 4% shrinking of our GDP, which is the ODR figure, is simply purely speculative and takes no account of the fact that improving our international trade, which I'll come to in a moment, is likely to produce a much greater improvement. So there are many reasons which we can go into in great detail if you wish later, but I think we can take off the table. The second is a net shortage of labour. At the moment, we have a country which is not suffering from mass unemployment. On the contrary, there are many jobs which are chasing workers. It's therefore to do with workforce choice. And one of the things that the British workforce has got used to in the last 20 years or so has been not doing the sorts of jobs, particularly in the agricultural sector, which were done by very low paid transient or immigrant labor coming often from Eastern Europe. If people were prepared to take these jobs, then we wouldn't have had the circumstance where we saw good food being wasted. But I'm not going to talk about that because I think that's going to be Tristram's comment. The third thing I think it's not about is any inefficiency in the food marketing system. The way in which the supermarkets coped with COVID simply stands for itself as an example. Supermarkets operate in the free market. They are extraordinarily good at reallocating whatever it is that they're selling, and in this particular case, food, and moving from one source to another as circumstance demands. And if you contrast it with the rationing model that's built into any nationalized structure, for example, the NHS, the contrast is absolutely astonishing. And so, therefore, there is a sort of built-in safety net so long as you don't overregulate the food selling market. So, what are the things that I think that that this might be worth discussing? That I think this might be about. Well, one is quite obvious, which is the enormous increase in the population in these islands. When Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, the population was 56 million, and today it's 68 million. So we have millions more mouths to feed. And how do we do that? Part of that is through British agriculture. But British agriculture is a very small part of the economy. It's 0.54% of the total UK gross value added. It's about 10.3 billion pounds. So it's really quite a small sector, although it is very efficient at producing food across the spectrum. It depends on doing what we've done for the last 200 years, which is being rational about and maximizing our food imports. And one of the things that I think helps to explain the difficulties we're in has been the failure to fully exploit the new trade arrangements which were made over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly with Australia and New Zealand. It is worth remembering that this year is the 140th anniversary of the arrival in Britain of the SS Dunedin, which was the first refrigerated ship to bring chilled sheep meat from New Zealand to Britain. Queen Victoria herself went down to the dock to actually greet this ship. And there is a logical partnership between hemispheric partners. It used to be called Commonwealth Preference before we went into the EU. And of course, these trade deals with Australia and New Zealand essentially restore that. And it's a natural synergy because the seasons are inverted between the Northern and the Southern Hemisphere. A third thing, which I think we ought to think about, is misguided overregulation of the UK farming sector. The farming sector, and I know this because I live in the middle of the West Country and I live in farming country and we have land ourselves. The farming sector has been crippled with overregulation. It was during the EU period, but now we carried across full high dynamic alignment to European Union regulations, and those have stayed more or less in place. But it's other regulations which push farmers towards taking their land out of food production. Things like rewilding, for example, or the prioritization of land sterilization for so-called renewables, allowing prime agricultural land to be taken out of food production to put up solar farms which produce virtually no useful electricity, and whatever it is they do produce is extremely expensive, which leads actually to the fifth reason, and I think in many ways the central one, that people like the lady at the beginning are facing the difficulties they have, which is that they have massive increases in other obligatory expenditures, and those are especially on heat and on light and on transport. And this is an extraordinary story because 20 odd years ago, we had in this country one of the most robust and cost-effective electrical grids in the industrial world. And today we have one of the most fragile. And so, no, it is not the result of Mr. Putin's war. No, it is not the result of nasty people in the Middle East. It is the result overwhelmingly of the decision to engage on an excursion into so-called renewable energy. I say so-called because it isn't renewable, and it is, in its nature, the most expensive sort of energy you can produce because it's so low-grade thermodynamically that you have to run backup from firm power, that is to say, at the moment, principally from gas and to a degree, increasingly now back again to coal. You have to do these things. There is no green transition. There cannot be because it's forbidden by the laws of physics. You can't break the second law of thermodynamics. But in trying to do so, two things have happened. One is that successive governments, Labour and Conservative, have essentially smashed the market signalling in the energy sector. And we now have an extraordinary situation in the United Kingdom where we are using less electricity than we have done at any time since the early 1970s. And the total primary energy use of the UK is back to the levels of the 1950s. And this, for those watching, is not something to be proud of. It's rather like somebody who is suffering from a desperate disease like anorexia saying, look, I'm so slim, isn't this wonderful? I'm suffering from anorexia. This is a sign of something an illness in the economy rather than a strength. There are two other subsidiary ones, and then I will stop. One, and this is one of these acts of God, or in fact, in this case, probably acts of Xi Jinping, which are the consequences of the COVID virus and the mismanagement of it through the lockdowns. This was a completely unexpected impact on the economy. It knocked the public finances for six. That's one of the reasons that we are in the financial problems that we are now. Because essentially the government, incredibly, paid everybody to stay at home during the period of these lockdowns. And it's not just the financial costs, it's the contingent costs, because many people have now actually lost the appetite to work. Many people have left, particularly skilled middle-aged people, have left the labour market altogether. And for younger people, the opportunities that they have of getting back into lucrative work are much restricted. And finally, I have a tin to show you. Here it is. Can you read this? It came from the Second World War, and this was produced by the League of National Safety. You see, and it says food. Buy it with thought. Cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, serve just enough, use what is left, which I think is probably a good point on which I can hand over to Tristan, who's going to talk about using food efficiently and not wasting it.
Will then be Tristram Stewart. And so by way of background, Tristram is an international award-winning author, speaker, campaigner, and expert on the environmental and social impacts of food. I will pass over to Tristram.
Right. Well, I'm just going to try and give myself space to both say what I was going to say and also offer some reflections on some of the professors' comments about why we're in the problem that we are facing. But I want to start by saying that whilst food supply, food production is absolutely the heart of what I tend to look at in my daily life, we also need to acknowledge that food insecurity, whilst it relates obviously to food, its primary cause is poverty. And poverty is not a result of solar farms or even issues to do with food production and food waste. It's to do with economic structures which successive governments, both in the UK and internationally, have had in place and which have resulted in colossal inequality within society. So the richest people have been getting richer and the poorest people have not been getting richer in real terms. And I do not agree that this is primarily because people are disinclined to work or that they are disinclined to do hard work on farms. It is to do with the disparity in the economic opportunities that are available to them. And we just need to look at the impulse of the Truss government, which proposed to lower the tax rate for the richest people in our country, to see where those kinds of fiscal policies have had their homeland. So poverty is the problem. I don't propose to solve poverty in the course of the next 3 minutes that I talk about, but I want everything that I say about food production, food waste, and the rest of it to be seen as one part of a much bigger economic problem. And the United Kingdom is not an island in the economic sense of the word. We are enmeshed within a world economic system. All that said, it's important to remember that if we compare food supply now to pretty much any time in history, we have a vastly greater food surplus beyond the basic necessary dietary requirements of the human population than we have ever had in history. We have in rich countries, in our shops and restaurants, between, if you include both the actual calories available and also the calories indirectly available but suboptimally used in the food supply chain, and I'm going to come on to that in a second. If you include all the available calories, both directly and indirectly, we have between 3 and 4 times the calorific requirements of the population. So where does all that food go? Well, a lot of it goes into bins, and we are all familiar with the idea that we can use the food in our pantries, in our fridges much more efficiently. Household food waste is a colossal problem. We all have the ability to reduce that in ways that will both reduce our impact on the environment and also improve our economic situation, because we can spend much less on food than we currently do. That is absolutely the case. That said, since I started campaigning on this issue, and the measurements of household food waste began in 2007, 2008, households have reduced per capita 1/3 of the food that they were wasting then. So people have got that message. A lot of that is to do with awareness raising around food waste. Other influences include economic constraints, people essentially feeling the pinch and therefore saving money in the way that everyone would expect them to. Now, that is an incredibly high level of mass behavior change. There are very few environmental campaigns around the world that have succeeded in implementing that kind of mass behavior change. But it does still leave another 2/3 of our food waste available to us to eat into, as it were. And of course, there are many ways in which we can do that. And your video talked about, for example, maybe ignoring sell-by dates that have nothing to do with food safety. So the best before date, which is only a guarantee of optimal quality, has huge margins of error built into it, is distinct from the use-by date. The use-by date, if it says use-by, that is a food hygiene recommendation. But all the other dates you read, sell-by, best before, that's just to do with a manufacturer's quality guarantee. And if you open it up and have a look and have a sniff and have a little taste, it will do you no harm. And a lot of that food that gets thrown away can still be eaten, and much of it is actually being thrown away well before the date anyway, as the data suggests. But the other area, of course, where the food supply chain, before I touch on that, household food waste has been overly emphasized by policymakers and certainly by the corporate interests within the food supply chain. Supermarkets love to blame what they call consumers. I prefer to think of them as citizens for the food waste problem. But the vast majority of food that is wasted happens well before it gets anywhere near consumers or citizens. And supermarkets that control the vast majority of grocery sales within the United Kingdom are responsible for a large part of the profligacy and wastage within our food supply system. Professor Prince says that the NHS is vastly more inefficient than the supermarkets. I'm rather less of a fan, and the reason for that is because I've read reports made not just by hardline environmentalists like myself, but by the United Kingdom's Competition Commission, which identified the supermarkets as offloading the risk within the market and the waste that goes with that onto their suppliers. The supermarkets themselves have become very efficient. Of course, they waste hundreds of thousands of tons of perfectly good food, and it's an absolute crime. And by the way, in my personal life, I get most of my groceries from the bins outside the back of supermarkets, where I find, just last night, I fed my family with beef steak that had been discarded by one of the supermarkets by the kilo, several kilos of it, organic chickens, hundreds of eggs, loads of fresh fruit and vegetables, all of it perfectly fit for consumption. All of it should have been donated to charities to help the most vulnerable, but it continues to go in the bin. Of course, there have been increases in food donations in recent years, but there's still plenty more food that supermarkets are throwing away. But the stuff that they throw out the back of the store and I go and rummage around in the bins to reclaim where I can is a tiny percentage of the total waste that they actually cause, because the way in which they control the supply into their stores is through their suppliers. So they might, for example, tell a supplier of green beans in Kenya that they want a certain amount of green beans every week, that supplier is then absolutely obliged to provide that quantity of beans. If they fail to meet the order, they'll be delisted or blacklisted and can potentially lose their entire business. So there's an intense pressure on suppliers always to be available, always to be able to supply what the supermarket has said. But the supermarket retains absolute right, because they're not contractually obliged to buy that stuff. They're just saying this is what we want. If in fact cheaper beans become available from Guatemala or locally, or if in fact British consumers buy fewer beans than they anticipated, because I don't know, it's been raining and people don't eat beans in the rain, or they don't eat as much lettuce or whatever it is, there's less purchasing than they anticipated, they will just cancel that order or amend it at the last minute. They will arbitrarily impose strict cosmetic standards more strictly than they do at other times. So they have a variable strictness. If there's a shortage of supply, they'll just take anything that's coming. But if they've got a surplus, they'll say, oh no, we can't take that because it's, you know, the beans are slightly bent or they're the wrong shape or size or whatever. And therefore they dump all of that waste onto the supplier. And I've been to the depots outside Nairobi airport where a lot of these green beans come from, and seen enormous mountains of produce being wasted in one of the hungriest countries in the world. And that is directly as a result of supermarket policies. So they offload the risk in the market, the fact that you can't anticipate exactly how much people are going to buy, onto their suppliers. That is a massive inefficiency of resources. And as the Competition Commission said, it is the citizens, the consumers, who bear the cost of that ultimately, as well as the suppliers. So that wastage is obviously, in the context of food insecurity amongst the most vulnerable members of society, it is what the Competition Commission called a moral hazard. And it is up to us, it is up to the Groceries Code Adjudicator to ensure that supermarkets observe what is enshrined in law, the code of practice that tells them that they cannot cancel orders at the last minute, and they cannot amend orders at the last minute with the result that suppliers should bear the cost of that wastage. It is very regrettable that the government is currently looking at getting rid of the Groceries Code Adjudicator as an institution. It was an act that was passed in 2013. It's very, very important to keep that government department in its independence. I would argue it's actually very important to give it additional powers, not take them away, because at the moment it only protects UK suppliers and direct suppliers of supermarkets, whereas supermarkets buy a lot of their produce indirectly through middlemen. So a lot of those farmers in Kenya are actually unprotected. That is something that we should be looking at if we want to make sure that the food system is fairer, both to citizens and also to suppliers. I know I've pretty much run out of time, but I do want to say a couple of things. The idea that food security has happened as a result of renewable energy or a very welcome reduction in energy consumption in the UK, I wholeheartedly dismiss. And this is something I was very bemused to hear the professor kind of lay the blame at those feet. I do wholeheartedly agree with him that solar farms on productive agricultural land is an absolutely irrational policy. We should not be putting solar panels on farms. That should be withdrawn. We should not be giving fiscal incentives to farmers to do that. Doing that takes productive land out of production, either entirely or massively diminishing the productivity of that land, because the sun can no longer fall on the plants, the grass, or whatever it is that would have been growing there. That means that the net increase in demand for food globally has to be met by getting land from elsewhere. And unfortunately, the way in which land is being got for agricultural production is by chopping down the world's remaining Amazon and other forests to grow more and more food. And that is very, very bad for the environment. for biodiversity, and also will come back and bite us in the behind, because if we have climate change, as all scientists of note agree we now have and will increasingly see in coming decades, that is going to create a greater food crisis than any that we have seen previously. War in Ukraine will appear like a storm in a teacup compared to, for example, a drought in the whole of the northern hemisphere in the growing season, and that is the kind of thing that we are likely to see much more of. I have run out of time. I've got loads of other things to say, but I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristram. Next, we'll move to Baroness Verma. As you've seen, she was the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Department for International Development, and she is also very proud of her role as Chancellor at Roehampton University, as a university that has a lot of first-generation students coming to it, and often from families that are vulnerable and most affected by the issues that we're speaking about today. Baroness Verma, thank you.
Thanks very much, Lizzie, and apologies to your listeners today for my rather gravelly, horrible voice, but it's I think it's just going to be tolerated by you all if you can understand me properly. It's really interesting subject, but I want to unpack some of what I've heard already, and part of it is that, you know, when we moved away maybe 2.5, 3 decades ago, from looking at what we produced ourselves in the UK, whether it was manufacturing of clothes or growing food items, I think we veered too far into quick fixes by going into countries, not paying, as Tristram has rightly pointed out, not paying through food security for the growers in Africa or elsewhere, but also for our own desire to have everything on our doorstep as quickly and as cheaply as possible. There will always be a price to pay when you expect everything to be quick, cheap, and available. And, you know, if we are to just unpack a little bit about why we've got a workforce issue in this country, where the professor rightly points out we have the highest employment levels for a very long time, it's because we have focused so much on taking people into academic routes and failing to see that social mobility comes in many different guises. And part of social mobility, allowing and enabling people from all backgrounds to actually benefit from growing, is to be able to use lots of levers and not ones that are just focused on going through particular educational routes. And, you know, in 1997, when the Labour Party came in with the desire for 50% of students to go to university, my fear factor then was, and is now the same, that we were actually destroying some of our really needy professions that were the backbone of our country, whether it was carpentry or bricklaying or in construction or basic farming. You know, going out there and being proud of being able to earn an income and being able to develop social mobility through not just the academic route, but through our hands, the practical jobs that every single country needs. Now, I'm a great believer that, you know, we have got more than enough produce on the planet if we use it wisely. And as Tristan has rightly said, the amount of wastage that happens every single day, because we have got into a belief that we need to buy more than we need. It's very tempting to buy those offers that are there available, buy one and get one free type offer, you know, and not look at the need of our own individual selves. So, if we're going to start unpacking, how do we actually stop wastage, stop the need to want everything in the now, not appreciate, as I think the professor put up the canister that says, something about look at what you're buying, how you're buying it, and how you're treating it. And I think those are the important issues for us to be able to start going back to a few of those areas that in the past we've dealt with probably a lot better than we're dealing with now, because we've got so much consumer need thrown at us every single day via the media. And it's become an addiction to want it now, to want it cheap, and to want to be able to say, well, actually, because it didn't cost a lot, we can actually bin it, landfill it, and destroy the planet in the same breath. So, I think that for me, as a person whose business, one of her businesses I chair, is renewable energy, and it's renewable energy on the African continent, where there is an abundance of sunlight. So we're using it to help farmers through solar irrigation pumps actually try and make their yields better, make what they produce better, but they need to add value to it, so that when we're buying it, we're not buying it so that it's cheap for the supermarkets and there's no accountability and the cost of that. We give fair prices to the farmers there, so that they actually, we aren't an island on ourselves. I mean, I know we're saying UK is facing food insecurity. We're facing food insecurity for a whole host of reasons. We have a dependency on things coming from across the waters, and so the fuel costs have gone up. COVID totally and utterly slammed the global economy. So we're as a world, we are all having to pick up and reevaluate what we want and how we want it. And I think it's an opportunity for us. Actually, it's an opportunity for us to be able to ask ourselves, do we want to really, really go back to the world we've just left, where everything was so easy to get and had little value for us because we didn't put a value on it? And now we're facing huge amounts of debt. We're facing huge cost rises. I mean, I was actually talking to my husband this morning about, the cost of fresh fruit and how it's rocketed up, and fresh vegetables, because we tend to buy enough food for what we want to use for the day, and seeing the cost of that going up. But also the fact that we're not prepared to work our own lands, that, people don't value the fact that if we can go back to working our lands, where I do agree with the professor is that we have put so many obstacles in the way of our farmers, that we've not supported them enough, that we are making our farmers actually utilize land for alternative uses because they just cannot get the food value out of the chain, by growing it here. And yes, we can do free trade deals, and yes, of course, we don't want to go backwards in not being able to access choice. But if that choice comes at a cost to not just us here in the UK, but to the wider world population, then really, do we want to have that sort of pressure on our consciences that is stopping of us from making the right choices? I was part of the government under Cameron that did the reforms on electricity, to allow greater options and choices for people in the renewable sector to be able to be on par with the opportunities that the traditional fossil fuel sector had. And I think that was the right thing to do. I think we need to cut down on our carbon emissions, but that doesn't mean that we cut down internally here in the UK and force that somewhere else across the waters in another country. I think our duty is not just to ourselves here, but to the world population, so that we all have a much better place. COVID actually made me very anxious, that we were hearing about specialists say that, no, the COVID pandemic is not going to end until everybody has got vaccinated, and yet we were so determined that the poorest of the poor still remained outside of the vaccinations. So, whilst this is an argument and a discussion around food insecurity in the UK, I do genuinely believe that the way we utilize our food, the way we actually source our food, and the way we fail to protect our own growers here in being able to get the best for their produce, we do need to have a serious discussion. That I come from the rags trade, that was where I did my first foot into business. And when I saw cheap imports being readily available and destroying our own manufacturing base here, it was the death knell for a lot of traditional sectors here, where social mobility was enabled because people could come in and use their skills. I think this is a much larger debate. And I know that from the questions that are coming up, we cannot go on the way we've been doing trade, whether it's internally in the UK or whether it's externally with countries that are desperate to trade outwards to increase their own economies, and yet their own people go hungry. I can't see the fairness in it, and I just feel that when we're looking at basic food costs here, we have got to be asking the question on how, first of all, how do we hold the buyers that produce the food in the supermarkets, how are they actually negotiating on our behalf? And secondly, how are we supporting through, whether it's through mechanisms through government or mechanisms through buying, and as a consumer, as a customer, how do we ensure that we are also helping the marketplace here? I think I just feel very much that we've offset all of our own responsibilities elsewhere. And whilst we can probably manage, maybe it'll be harder, but we will manage because we still have lots of mechanisms in place to do that. I think we do need to keep one eye on the rest of the world, where we are exploiting their produce to shore up our own hunger for cheap goods to be available readily. I think if we try and balance the equation out, we will find that there is a much easier way of dealing with all of the other migration issues that we talk about every single day. Shock, horror, people want to come here for a better life, and yet we are not prepared to make their lives in their own countries better. So this is a much wider debate, but I think on the core question of food insecurity, I think that the reasoning behind it is that we need to make sure that those who are responsible for bringing in food have also got a responsibility to ensure that they are a part of the solution to help with those really, really struggling with being able to buy the bare basics today. Thanks, Lizzie.
Thank you, Baroness. We're going to move to questions now. We've got already 6 questions and about 20 minutes remaining. So the first question, I'm going to go straight away. It's from Darren Mackey. And the question is, how can you say that putting barriers to trade between the UK and our nearest trading partners has not had an effect? And I'm going to ask Professor Prince to respond to that question, please.
Rich menu we've got in front of us from what my colleagues have said as well. And by the way, Baroness, congratulations on your heroic performance in dealing with your voice problem. Thank you for making the sacrifice for us. The answer to Mr. Mackey is that it's a red herring question. There is no effective barrier. What has happened was that those during the debate now 6 years ago over whether or not we should leave the European Union, those who were behind what was known at the time as Project Fear predicted that we're going to be all sorts of difficulties There were going to be enormous queues of lorries, and we were not going to have any food in the supermarkets and all this. None of this, of course, came true. As I said in my very brief comment about this at the beginning, look at this major new study that's been produced just 2 weeks ago. You can see that we have essentially returned to trend. We have one of the fastest growing total GDPs in Europe. We're mid-table on this. Our growth rate 6.8%. So, we're well above Italy and Germany, and we're just behind France. As far as food supply from Europe is concerned, it's true that we do import, particularly soft fruits and things like that. But our food import pattern in this country was actually, if you look at the 40 years of our involvement with the European Economic Community /EU, this was actually an excursion rather than the norm. We have simply returned to trend over the 200-year pattern. I mentioned the Dunedin. And in this, we trade more outside than we do inside. And so I can set your mind at rest, Mr. Mackey. Leaving the European Union has actually been a net benefit in terms of increasing our ability to renovate our trade with the wider world, which had been attenuated. We kicked the Australians and New Zealanders in the teeth in 1973. They then redirected much of their external sales to China and to Asia. But we now have a chance, and we are busy re-establishing that. So it is, as I say, a red herring. But I want, as I'm speaking, just to say how glad I am that I brought my tin to this debate, because thank you so much, Baroness. Yes, I want just to put to bed this point about renewables. And I need, in terms of free declaration, of honest declaration, I just ought to perhaps explain that I am by origins an Africanist. I lived in the African bush for 10 years. I speak African languages. I used to advise the Mandela government. I don't want to go into my full biography, but I do know Africa very, very well. And 30, 40 years ago, when renewables were very, very new, I wrote what became quite an influential article in The Guardian, arguing for off-grid uses of renewables in the Sunbelt. And my goodness, I mean, I have seen exactly what she describes. And in India, in many parts of Africa, renewables can be a genuine lifesaver. The problem that we have encountered has been this belief that you can actually produce a reversal of all the main trends that have made the world rich and healthy and wealthy in absolute and in relative terms over the last 200 years. It cannot be done. And this is what we're now living with here in the North, because renewables are very unreliable, and because they're uncontrollable, they also require constant backup, which is why they're so expensive in the two key metrics, EROEI, energy return on energy invested, and also in absolute cost. And what we're dealing with now in this country, which I find morally obnoxious, is a rationing system for energy that is reducing the amount of energy that we're actually using. The use of energy is an index of the health of an economy, not a sign of improvement in the way that Tristram thought. And so, we have a situation now where, as a result of these unwise interventionist policies, government-driven, the signaling of the market has been disturbed. And well, Tristan and I just have a fundamental difference. I think that the most humane and efficient way that humanity has ever discovered of allocating decisions is the free market, and it makes everybody richer. As societies get richer, then the tide raises all boats, and the evidence for that historically is absolutely clear. And so, yes, of course, you have people in relative poverty, and you have some people in absolute poverty in this country. But my goodness me, don't give the impression, please, that we have got a country that here is anywhere like the way that it was, say, in the times of my grandparents. It's simply not true. And one final point about supermarkets. Yes, there's much. We can agree, Tristan, about a great deal about supermarkets. We can agree that they do the things that you described, but you miss the fundamental question, which is why they do it. And they do it for a reason that Hugh Fermi-Whittingstall and some of the other celebrity chefs have been banging on about for a long time. They do it because consumers are not well trained in what's on my famous tin, as it is now, the wartime tin. They are too used to too wide a range of out-of-season foods. And the supermarkets, of course, respond. That's what they will do. And if people won't eat wonky beans, then the wonky beans will go out the back, and lucky old you if you can pick them up. But don't confuse that with the supermarkets doing anything other than their normal business. I live in a part of the world where most of us shop direct from small producers. We're lucky to be able to do that. Many people in cities can't do that. It would be nice if they could. But supermarkets are terrific as allocative devices. It is absolutely true what you say, that they do very, very stringent deals with producers, both overseas and in this country. And all of those things are things we can agree need to be addressed. But please don't mix up your apples and pears, if I can put it like that.
Thank you, Prince. I'm going to ask us to come back to slightly a point that Tristram made earlier about inequality, and sort of touching on what Prince said, you know, working on the ground with people. I started working in North Kensington in 2006, and that time employment was a route out of poverty. In the last 2 years, people's situations have gotten worse. We've had people eating out of bins. We've got people reading by candlelight. And so people really are living in poverty. You know, having grown up in the 70s, I remember ice on the inside of the windows and food parcels, and people cannot eat. They cannot afford to feed themselves and their families at the moment. And so this will bring me to the next question. I hope you can respond to my point and to the question, which is what exactly is defined as food insecurity? There's been a lot of talk about, you know, markets and trading and so on. So what is it exactly that we're talking
about? Sorry, who do you want to?
Who would prefer? Tristram, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weave the answer to that. I mean, it's quite simple. Food security is defined as being unable to afford a healthy diet, and that can happen either chronically, so you are simply in a state perpetually of not being able to afford enough food to eat a healthy diet. It can be temporary, so you're just going through a particular time of financial insecurity, or it can be seasonal. And what we've seen in the United Kingdom is a massive increase recently in the number of people who are going without meals and not eating a healthy diet because of the financial constraints on them. The Food Foundation charity recently pointed out that there were around 7.3 million people in the United Kingdom who are reporting that they go without enough food. It's an interesting conundrum. Even within the food industry, the food sector workers, 25% of people working in the food industry live in food insecurity. They're saying that they don't get enough food and they can't afford it. Now, contrast that to the fact that the supermarkets in Britain made record profits over the same period, returning profits of £1 billion. That's £540 for each individual human being in the United Kingdom who can't afford enough food to feed their bodies, or in the case of children, many millions of children are also in food security. Their parents are not able to feed them adequately. I mean, that's about £540 into some very wealthy people's pockets per person. You know, if you just take a very simple food staple like lentils, one of the cheapest ways that you can feed a family, goes wholesale at about £1 a kilo. It's going up, of course, but you know, roughly that's more than adequate. That amount of money that's going into shareholder pockets to lift everyone in the United Kingdom who is suffering from food security out of food security. So you know, that I just point that out as one illustrative example of the point that I was making about the inequality that grows in this country and the grotesqueness of it. I do want to give a riposte to the professor's patronising comments about the fact that I don't understand and the supermarkets are just responding to consumer fussiness. I really encourage him to have a look at the book that I published on the subject. The idea that consumers are just to blame essentially for the cosmetic standards of the supermarkets is absolutely wrong. Not only have I demonstrated that with innumerable instances and a lot of data, but the Competition Commission, as I mentioned, themselves pointed out this fact, which is that the supermarkets apply those cosmetic standards selectively when it suits their economic interests. So I'll give an example. In 2007, 2008, we had a lot of rain over the summer. That meant that around 40% of the UK's potato harvest was wasted. It went green, got washed away and rotted. The potato supply from the United Kingdom into the supermarkets did not go down. We did not import more potatoes and sales of potatoes remained as they would normally be. How did all those potatoes end up on supermarket shelves? As I demonstrated in my book, the way in which the supermarkets responded to that is by relaxing the cosmetic standards that they normally applied on potatoes. So instead of saying, no, we don't want any of those misshapen, too big, too small potatoes, they said, yeah, give us everything you've got. And they put it on the supermarket shelves. Did consumers respond by complaining to supermarkets? Did they respond by buying fewer potatoes? No, they did not. None of those things happened. People bought them. They didn't even notice that these potatoes that normally were being rejected were on the supermarket shelves. That is one instance of, I mean, it's absolutely consistent. The cosmetic standards are used artificially to control the supply. And the way in which supermarkets do that is if they just cancel an order full stop, under the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act 2013, they are liable to share the cost of the waste that their supplier incurs as a result of that order cancellation. If they fail to do that, they are liable to fines of up to 1% of their turnover, a colossal fine. So one of the ways in which they get round that law is by saying, well, if you look at the document that we've given you about cosmetic standards, your produce does not meet that cosmetic standard, and that's why we're rejecting this consignment, thereby getting round the fact that they're not allowed just to cancel an order. That is one of the primary functions of these cosmetic standards, and I really invite Professor Prince to look at the way in which the Competition Commission themselves picked apart how this disproportionate power that supermarkets have within the supply chain plays out in unfair trading practices and the transfer of risk onto their suppliers. That is not just me, that is the Competition Commission. He talks about the free market. The whole point is that the Competition Commission was saying the free market is not working because of the oligopoly, the control of a very small number of people of the entire supply chain. The market, therefore, is breaking down, and it was the Competition Commission's view that this, therefore, need to be rectified in the interests of the proper operation of the free market. Point made.
Hello, Lizzie.
Yeah, Professor Prince, I think you're
Just very, very quickly. I think there are two things. I mean, there's an interesting longer discussion here, Tristan. Firstly, simply look at the sector and look at the way in which the German insurgent supermarkets have suddenly blossomed, and look at the way in which they sell their, wonky tomatoes and all those sorts of things. I mean, you're turning it into some sort of conspiracy theory, but underlying this is a much more fundamental question that you have to answer, which is that if you don't like the efficiency of free market distribution, what are you proposing instead? Are you proposing, and it would be a perfectly respectable thing for you to propose, something which the Labour Party thought about a lot in 1944, which is the nationalisation of food supply. I tremble at the thought myself, but is that where you're going?
This is a bogus straw man. I've not said anything about that. If you listen to what I just said,
I know you haven't.
It was the ineffectiveness. It was the fact that the free market wasn't working. The market does work. A free market requires the market to operate. I have not said anything about replacing a market economy with a state-owned food supply chain. Nothing that I've said could be interpreted in that way.
So what would you do?
Well,
what would you do to maintain the efficiency of distribution?
Allow me to reply to your question. The
Please.
Groceries Code Adjudicator Act was passed by an Act of Parliament in 2013 to allow the supermarkets to operate within an effective free market, thus removing the monopolies that the oligopoly, the small number of supermarkets that were disrupting and behaving anti-competitively. The very thing that you are defending is exactly the recommendation that I actually made, which is that we need to, if anything, strengthen the Groceries Code Adjudicator and not weaken it as per the proposition by this government in the current, just recently passed consultation. That is what my recommendation was. I made it in my first talk. And you have persistently projected the idea that I'm just trying to say, well, the state should control the food supply chain. Absolutely not. What I actually think is that a combination of free market and also common pool resource management, which doesn't require the intervention either of the state or allow it just to be controlled by the free market. And those are the suggestions that I've made, and those are the ones that I absolutely stick to, and they're underpinned by a lot of very clear evidence, and also the opinion of the United Kingdom's Competition Commission.
But
thank you. I'm going to just Baroness.
Sorry, Lizzie, I just want to add one very important point to all of this. We've also got to look at consumer responsibility.
Absolutely.
I think, we have really, really got to question ourselves. We have a responsibility of questioning ourselves as well. So all of what you're saying is fine, but ultimately choices are made, and choices are made by us. So if we are going to make those choices, and then we can hold our supermarkets or the retailers, whoever, in whatever field it is, to account. But I do think that, the fact that we've lost control of what we want every single day has made it is so difficult now for those that really do need to make those choices, have those choices, because those choices have been taken away. And, I just want us to go to a time where we value what's in front of us. And I think actually we've become such a disposable community in this country, and we just need to reevaluate that.
Well, the Baroness is absolutely right. Absolutely right. We, as a proportion of total spend over the last 40 years, we now spend an extraordinarily small proportion across the whole population on food. Food is underpriced in terms of its importance to us. It's one of our fundamentals, along with heat and light and transport. What the present crisis has brought to the fore, and maybe in a perverse way it's welcome, is exactly the conversation that the Baroness is now pointing us towards, that we have to ask ourselves, along with Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall and the others who are also making this point, that lost in the last 40 years or so, particularly since the last 80 years, since the war, people have lost fundamental skills. They expect to be able to get their food, pre-processed, pre-made. They don't cook from raw materials. And then, which we haven't touched on, we also have another development, which has been the people who argue that a balanced diet, which means, since we are omnivores, a diet which includes meat as well as plant-based foods, is somehow preferable. And indeed, in the more militant end of that argument, that people should be forced not to eat meat. I mean, even an elementary knowledge of the history of agriculture tells you that in these islands, the agricultural cycle, which makes our fertile island what it is depends on having plants and animals all mixed up together. So, I mean, we have got, I think, a shared set of responsibilities here. But no, I mean, Tristram, I mean, I haven't had the benefit of reading your book, but I have read Tim Lang's books over the years, so I am not totally unfamiliar with this area of research. And it's of course the case. I'm not, I'm not setting up a straw man for you. I'm asking actually a reasonable question, because you've made it quite clear that you think that there are excess profits being made and that somehow this is a wicked thing. I mean, you may think, I rather suspect from what you said in your first statement, that you do think that because you made comments about forcing equality, I rather think that you do think that profit is a dirty word, which I don't. So, I mean, we fundamentally disagree about that.
This is, again, a complete straw man, Professor Prince. I have a company myself, Toast Ale. We turn waste bread from the food industry into beer.
I read about
try very hard to make a profit. It is absolutely not the case, nothing I've said could be interpreted reasonably as suggesting that I have anything against profit. However, where there is a growing inequality and the richest are getting richer and the poorest are not being able to feed themselves, it is an entirely rational fiscal policy, for example, not, as the Truss government, as I pointed out, to reduce tax on the richest people in this country. And my proposal is that we don't do that sort of thing. We've seen what the results in your beloved free market were when the government decided to do that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of fiscal policy that I'm talking about. The fact that the food sector workers, 25% of them are living in food security, is an indication of poor wages. Now, poor wages have been sustained by importing cheap labor historically. And you say that those people, the reason why there's so much food wasted is because people didn't go and pick the strawberries because people don't want that kind of work. The reason why they don't want that kind of work, Professor Prince, is because it's so badly paid. And it's very, very hard work. You live in temporary accommodation, you get bussed around. I mean, if you've ever spent a season fruit picking in this country, you'll know it's extremely hard work. Now, one of the ways of solving that problem is to pay those people more money and thereby eat into the profits, the £4 billion of profits that have gone into dividends for supermarket owners, to use that money, a proportion of it, to pay people better wages, thereby allowing them to feed their families enough food. Now, I think it is insulting to suggest that the reason why those families are going hungry is because they don't know how to cook anymore, or because they throw away too much food. That, of course, I'm absolutely in favor. And by the way, you keep on mentioning Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, a close buddy of mine, and I was his food waste advisor for the series that you keep on referring to. He and I are absolutely 100% aligned on all of these issues.
He was 6 years now.
Sorry?
Tristan, just very quickly on your point about Truss. Truss was there for a very short period of time. We are now in a government that actually is trying to be very, very fiscally responsible. However, I mean, I'm not a great fan of lots of things, but what I do appreciate is when people are trying to reset something that was done and was wrong, and a lot of us were pointing out it was wrong. But I do think that, we're not going to say that, fruit picking or any of that sort of work is not hard. And I agree we should always pay the right wage for the work. But I also do think ultimately we've got to individually also ask ourselves what we're doing.
Of course we do, but it's both and.
One of the things that I've learned, through the work I'm, when I'm across in Africa, and I point out Africa because I see a lot of very hungry people going hungry, and yet the food they're producing is being sold here and then being binned really winds me up. Because I think, I would also like to see those proper markets working for them too. And so that we have a responsibility all around. But, coming back, I do think that we have lost the art. This is not a new problem. But people that have always had the least amount to spend have always been there. The saddest thing is we've enabled it and allowed it. And I want us to actually be a little bit more responsible. And I think that's where my sort of thinking comes down to, having looked at what's happening across the waters, is that how do we make sure that we pay our own people the right price by appreciating what we produce here seasonally, and then look outwards when we can't satisfy that shortage of other things that we can't grow here. I think that's where we really should look at our markets more and then pay the proper price for it.
Thank
Oh,
you.
amen to that. Amen to that. And also that we ensure that consumers become once again really concerned about their food, that they're prepared to accept that it's going to consume more of their disposable income, as it used to do in the past. You know, we lived through this extraordinary golden period where people have taken it for granted that they will have out of season foods and a vast range thereof, and they'll have it available all the time at essentially a price which permits them to go out and buy all sorts of iPhones and holidays in Ibiza and all that sort of thing. Of course, delightful things to be able to do, but when times become hard, when you're at war, as we now are, as happened during the last war when that tin was produced, then we come back to the basics, don't we? And in that context, yes, there will be, of course, a need to ensure that there isn't unfair competition. I'm not going to suggest, I'm not trying to put Tristan in a false position, and I'm sure he's not trying to put me in a false position. But one has to be extremely careful about the role that government takes. And the point that I've made throughout is that we are actually living now with the consequence of a long spell, 20 odd years really. It started with the Blair governments and then continued, unfortunately, continuously thereafter during the Cameron government and onwards. We have seen vastly too much regulation and control. And what this has the effect of doing across all these sectors that I mentioned that are linked together, with energy as the primary one, because it's the primary driver of the economy, is that it has confused the correct operation of the market. And when that happens, then you find yourself in the sort of circumstance that we now find ourselves in, and people suffer. So getting back to a situation which really basically, I talk to my neighbors around here, my neighboring farmers, and I say to them, what do you want? And they say, get government off our backs. And I thoroughly approve of that. They know how to produce beef and cattle extremely well around here, if people leave them alone to do it.
I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. I think we have a picture shared with us. Also, I just wanted to pick up on the fact that I think when we're talking about food insecurity in the UK, we're talking about the most vulnerable in society. And in my experience, there's a bit of a myth of holidays in Ibiza and iPhones, because a lot of people are also in digital poverty and not able to connect, which means they're also not able to improve their lives. I don't know any of the 2,000 people that we work with that have luxury holidays and so on. They do cook from scratch mostly and don't have a choice about what they eat. There's a question I think that feeds in. Somebody from the audience has said, how can profits by supermarkets be married with such massive food insecurity that runs into millions? I think you've mostly covered that, but I don't know.
Yeah, we did touch on it. I think we could build on what Professor Prince is saying, and in the spirit of seeing if there are more bridges between us than has been discovered so far. I mean, I myself think that most of the regulations that have applied to farmers have been useful, not all of them. But let's, environmental regulations that protect the environment are obviously key to the long-term health of our planet, and of course our food system depends upon the health of our planet. But let's go to one area that would be interesting. The United Kingdom spent in 2000 before Brexit, £3.5 billion on farm subsidies. Globally, national governments around the world spend more than $700 billion That's $700 billion spent every single year subsidizing farming. Currently, only 1% of that is spent on supporting ecological farming. Professor Princeton is, give him an opportunity to clarify. He said that, one of the reasons for food insecurity is that we've been paying farmers to take food out of production and into things like rewilding. And I really want to point out that only 1% of global farm subsidies are spent on supporting ecological farming, things like that. My own opinion is that if those $700 billion were spent supporting ecological farming, the farm sector not only could be subsidized to produce affordable, healthy food for everyone, but it would also enable farmers to be absolutely the front line, and indeed, I think, the most powerful agents for tackling the environmental crisis, because plants, the things they cultivate, suck carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what they do. Bless them. They've been doing it for a couple of billion years. And we know how to use that photosynthetic magic to get carbon back into the soil from which it has been leached and released into the atmosphere, particularly in the industrial era, with the use of nitrogen fertilizer, which of course is a massively carbon emitting process, the production of it, and the consequent neglect of the health of our soils, because if you can just cover it in nitrogen fertilizer, you don't need to worry in the short term about the structure and the health of your soil. But actually, if we use the organic power of plants to suck that carbon out of the atmosphere, to embed it in soils, both as manures, but also as composts and other green lays, and there's loads of ways in which farmers can be encouraged to build the carbon in their soils. That increases the water retentiveness of the soil. It reduces soil erosion. It increases fertility, and it also combats climate change. Now, if we subsidized farmers to do that, it would be in the long-term interests of food production, in my opinion. It would be in the long-term interests of combating climate change. It would help people to produce food for a longer period, because at the moment we judge farmers by how much they produce per year. That is the wrong parameter. It is how much they produce over 1,000 years or more that really matters if what we want is a healthy, sustainable food system for everyone. We've talked about meat very briefly. Now, I am no vegan. I've just received a message saying there's a roadkill deer just a few miles from my home, and I should get myself out there to go and get it. I have a herd of cows that do conservation grazing on the Heathland Nature Reserve neighbouring my home. I've always reared pigs on food waste, and I have a little flock of chickens that also eat food waste. So I'm absolutely behind the idea of eating meat. However, the use of industrial processes to maximize the production of meat and dairy that goes on in this country and goes on around the world at the expense of the environment, and indeed at the expense of human health, because in this country and in all rich countries, we eat vastly more meat and dairy than is good for our own health. The WHO's recommendation for a healthy diet is vastly lower than our current meat and dairy consumption. That is also bad. I talked about food surplus. We use grains and pulses like soy grown in the Amazon to fatten our livestock, to pump them full of as much nutrition as we possibly can. And that, again, that is being subsidized. It is being driven by the profitability of that system. And it is to the detriment of our health as well as our purses that we have such a meat and dairy intense diet. Professor Prince held up that wonderful wartime exhortation to reduce meat consumption. That applies now. Quite how that aligns, with his comments about energy anorexia. Why is it bad that we consume less energy, but it would be good if we consumed less energy-intensive meat? I'm not quite sure how you bridge those two. I myself think that we should be eating more resource-efficient foods. That generally means more plant-based foods, so a sack of lentils rather than a few steaks. We should be thereby saving the resources, protecting the environment, protecting our wallets, and protecting our health all at the same time, and having a healthy farm sector to boot. There we are.
Well, what happiness. We come towards the end of this, and Tristan and I are able to agree about a great deal. But there are a couple of stings in the tail of the point where we're going to agree. Yes, I myself am in a situation not much distant from yours. We eat organically, we grow organically, but here comes the rub. And the rub isn't theoretical. It's happening just across the North Sea at the moment. I don't know if listeners are aware of this, but there is a crisis happening in the Netherlands on a scale that has not happened in that normally extremely civilized and rich country in living memory. And I'm half Dutch, by the way, so I do know this quite well. The Dutch government has just ordered the compulsory purchase of 3,000 farms. And this, remember, is a country, a tiny country, which actually is, after the United States, the second or third largest net exporter of food. And in Europe, it is the largest single exporter of food. And this is producing something close to rebellion. Tractors blocking 70 miles of motorways. Why is this being done? To try and reduce the nitrogen use and output from intensive Dutch agriculture to levels which have been prescribed by regulation. But it goes to the heart of where he and I will agree. I think it's morally obnoxious to see photographs coming from China of multi-story pig farms in which, apart from anything else, the biohazard of putting 640,000 pigs into a building hardly bears thinking about. But it comes back to the fundamental, and there are two fundamentals. One is to do with price, and the other is to do with choice. Because the Baroness was saying before she left us just briefly, and I agree with her wholeheartedly, that in order to change this around, it is going to be not possible to do this by imposition and by regulation. It has to be done by education and by choice. And there is a huge job to be done. And people like Tim Lang, who I mentioned earlier, have had distinguished careers in attempting to explain to people how much of this lies in their own hands. What doesn't lie in their own hands at the moment is this self-harming crisis in the energy sector, which we are now living with, which has created this horrendous opportunity cost choice for the lady who was shown in the piece of film at the beginning of this podcast. I am sure that Tristan and I are going to be entirely in agreement that somebody like that lady should not be put into the position where she is having to talk to us in the way that she was forced to do. And much of that is a consequence of a misdirection of the use of government power. And it's been largely in the primary energy sector. How do I square the circle, Tristan? It's extremely simple. The energy that comes from food, we all require, and you talked, and we are in agreement about the non-sterilization of farmland with solar power. There is a very interesting calculation that's been made, which shows that you actually get more energy into the total national energy budget from growing food on the land than you do from trying to get it out of very inefficient solar panels. And that's that's a very satisfactory argument to be made against this sort of virtue signaling. But the problem that we got to now is that we've reached a scale with this experiment where we are now running into the buffers both nationally in terms of energy insecurity. We're going to be going into a winter with power cuts, which is intolerable and extraordinary in a country like this. And it is primarily as a result of having contorted the energy supply system, producing a situation where we are using less and less energy because of price rationing and because we are losing industry overseas. It's not that we are becoming more efficient in the use of our power. It's simply that most of our manufacturing industry has got into a ship and sailed off to the Far East, and much of it largely to China, where it's being powered by coal, by the way.
Thank you. Tristram, do you want to show Are you going to show an image?
Oh, it was to do with one of the I mean, can that be brought up? It's not answering Professor Prince's recent points, but we were talking about waste in supermarket supply chains, and this is a Kenyan farmer. That's the oranges are in Peru. These are this is 1,000 tons of tangelos wasted because of cosmetic standards. In the case of the tangelos, and this is a mange tout, ironically mange tout, which means eat everything. In France, not a single one were eaten because of the order cancellation that came through the middleman that was supplying the supermarkets in the United Kingdom with this food. And I'm really not exaggerating. Absolutely everywhere I went on my 6 or so trips to Kenya, I found farmers like this one who had gone into debt to grow food, who were using land that would previously have been used to supply food to local populations, or indeed wild spaces that were roamed on by lions and elephants, to grow food for our supermarkets and then not be paid a single cent for it because orders cancelled resulted in them just having no market to sell their produce. And that is absolute rife, and it is us, through our purchasing choices, who essentially are keeping in place businesses that are conducting business in this way. That is the kind of, well, we knew what to call a system that got African people to work and not be paid for their labor in the past. And yet I met plenty of African people who were growing food for us and not being paid for their work. And I've never felt more ashamed of my country of origin as I did when I visited those farms and met farm workers who were not paid their wages when orders were cancelled, who thereby were not able to feed their children, not send them to school, and risked losing their homes. These are the people at the very bottom of our supply chain. They suffer a kind of food insecurity that would really be shameful. If it would make us, I think, feel ashamed that we allow this kind of exploitation to go on. And it's my view that these we can call them imperfections of the free market are ones that are amenable to regulation. We made slavery illegal, and the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act tried to make the exploitation of farm suppliers in this way illegal. And it is a work in progress and process, and it's one that I think, in the interests of the planet, in the interests of some of the least well-off members of our global society, our global island, we need to continue. I absolutely agree that this goes hand in hand with our individual choices and our individual responsibility. If there's an old man that needs to cross the street, it is good. It's good behaviour. It's good social ethic to help them, and it's bad social ethic to push them over, grab their wallet, and steal £5 off them. Now, if I do the latter, I contribute in my individual way to a harm to society. If I do the former and help that person, in no way does that individual action go anywhere towards achieving world peace. And yet it is still the right thing to do. It is also the right thing to do to try to prevent war. These two things are individual responsibility and our systemic contribution to a global democratic system and financial system that benefits everyone. These two things go hand in hand. So I absolutely think supermarkets need to be held to account. I absolutely think that our government representatives need to ensure that they're held to account. I absolutely think that we also individually need to waste less food, eat less meat, behave more responsibly towards each other and the environment. And these two are both things that we need to do.
Tristan, they can be held to account. I mean, supermarkets can be held to account. Their annual reports need to demonstrate what they're doing. I mean, what we need to do is to make sure that shareholders of these vastly huge organizations ask those questions. I mean, ultimately, we do make choices, but I bang on and on and on about accountability through annual reports so that we can see what they're doing.
Exactly.
I want supermarkets that sell clothing to make sure that they're producing at least part of that percentage comes from manufactured goods in the UK,
Right.
because we need our manufacturing base here. COVID took COVID demonstrated to us incredibly hard, in a hard way, how we'd become so dependent on everything, poor quality coming from other places when we could have been producing it here ourselves. The PPE that we spent huge amounts of money on, and that ended up being wasted because it was of poor quality when we had manufacturers here who could have been producing it. It makes me really, really cross. So
Mm.
I think we can hold these people to account by making sure that they demonstrate what they're doing through their annual reports. And if their annual reports aren't demonstrating it, then we've got a place to start to
Mhm.
demand accountability and transparency. And I really do feel that we've allowed these big organizations across the globe to get away with a lot because we're not prepared to challenge, because we're too keen to want it to be now, quick today, quick, cheap today, and throw away tomorrow. And I really do think that there is a lot of wider debate to be had.
I think that's so wise, Baroness, if I may say, and I am delighted, and I commend Tristan for that very eloquent defense of ethical capitalism. Um, Not a word of that would I disagree with. Ethical capitalism is what has made all of us as healthy and wealthy and educated as we all are. And I want to make sure that for my children and my grandchildren and on into the future, we defend this system. I have seen quite enough in my career of planning systems and the consequences of people who think they know best attempting to force these choices. And I know it's difficult, but the Baroness said it in her previous intervention. It is difficult to say that we have such direct personal moral responsibilities, but I think that Tristan's example of the Good Samaritan in a modernized form uh, is exactly right. Of course, we have those responsibilities. And please also don't think, in case you do, that I'm unfamiliar with the world of which you were showing pictures. Um, Much of my life has been in sub-Saharan Africa, and I had the honor of being part of the advisory panel for the first Mandela government in South Africa when we were trying to reset the South African economy, which meant in important ways trying to reset the agricultural sector. So I have those familiarities, and they lead me to the conclusions that I've been sharing with you today. And I do think we've had a most rich, actually, and illuminating conversation. I'm most grateful to my fellow panelists for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you especially to Baroness. Thank you for making it back. I hope you feel better soon. Thank you to Tristram. And thank you so much to Professor Prince. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for your time, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.